Alright, so in this video I'm going to be going over some intermediate concepts, things about how the game mechanics of Yu-Gi-Oh work that aren't quite as basic as what I've been talking about in the previous videos, but stuff that's still important to know when you're trying to learn how to play Yu-Gi-Oh. So the first topic I want to cover is spell speeds and chains. So this is something I've hinted at, but I've kind of glossed over in my previous videos. So the first thing is spell speeds. So cards can only be chained to cards that are at the same spell speed or a lower spell speed. So for example, spell speed 1 is most monster effects and spells. So these are the slowest, and these cannot be chained to anything. So these have to be chain link 1, essentially, when they're on a chain. And then higher than that is spell speed 2. This is monsters with quick effects, quick play spell cards, and almost all trap cards are spell speed 2. So these can be chained to any spell speed 1 effect or any spell speed 2 effect. So these are most of the cards that will end up going on a chain. And then the third spell speed 3, are counter traps. So these can be chained to any spell speed, but nothing besides counter traps can be chained to counter traps because no other cards are spell speed 3. So now I'll talk about how chains work. With chains, this is how you activate card effects and have them resolve before your opponent's card effects resolve. So, for example, if one player activated Upstart Goblin, say we call them player A, and then player B decided to activate Call the Haunted in response to revive their Hanzo. So you would have to target Hanzo with Call the Haunted. And then player A chained Royal Decree to negate the effect of Call the Haunted. And then player B activated Wiretap to negate the activation of Royal Decree. So in this example, we have a spell speed 1, and then you chain a spell speed 2 to it, and then you chain another spell speed 2, and then you chain a spell speed 3 to that. So we have 4 cards on this chain: chain link 1, chain link 2, chain link 3, chain link 4. And chains will resolve backwards. So first, Wiretap resolves, which will negate Royal Decree and shuffle it back into the deck. Royal Decree is negated, so its effect no longer resolves. And then we go to chain link 2. Call of the Haunted is no longer being interfered with by Royal Decree, so Call of the Haunted will resolve and it'll special summon your monster successfully. And then Upstart Goblin will resolve and you'll draw 1 card. So just remember, chains resolve backwards. So if you want your effect to go off before your opponent's effect does, you have to chain your card to their card. The next thing I wanted to cover is problem-solving card text. So all cards that have been released since partway through 2011 are printed with problem-solving card text. This is a way of writing the effects that makes it easier to understand. So, for example, Solemn Warning is a card with problem-solving card text. And the two things I would like to bring attention to in this card are the colon right here between monsters and pay, and then there's a semicolon between life points and negate. So, how cards with problem-solving card text are written, everything that is before the colon is the condition. So that indicates when you are allowed to activate the card. So in this case, you can activate it when a monster would be summoned, or when a spell trap or monster effect is activated that includes an effect that would special summon a monster. So those are the only 2 times you are allowed to activate this card. And then between the colon and the semicolon is the cost. So that's the cost you have to pay to activate the card. So in this case, you have to pay 2,000 life points. And then everything that's written after the semicolon is the effect. So in this case, you negate the summon or activation and destroy the card. So something to keep in mind is when you activate a card, you pay cost immediately before the chain resolves. But the effect doesn't happen until the chain resolves. Another thing that I would like to point out is that some monster effects do not ever activate, this being continuous effects. You can tell this because they do not have any semicolons or colons anywhere in the effect. So if you read through Jinza's effect here, there aren't any semicolons or colons, so that means Jinza's effect never activates. This means it does not start a chain when it is summoned. Its effect just applies itself to the field. This is different for spell and trap cards though. Creature Swap also does not have any condition or cost, so it doesn't have a colon or a semicolon in it, but spell and trap cards always start a chain when they're activated. So Creature Swap will be counted as Chain Link 1 when you activate it, and your opponent can chain cards to it. The next thing I want to point out about problem-solving card text is that some monsters can summon themselves without starting a chain. These are called inherent special summons. So if you read the effect of Dark Armed Dragon, there's the part where it can special summon itself. It says, must be special summoned from your hand by having exactly 3 dark monsters in your graveyard. It cannot be special summoned by other ways. So there are no colon or semicolons anywhere during that part of the effect. So that effect to summon itself does not ever activate. And you see here that it has parentheses indicating where you summon it from your hand. That's another clue that it is an inherent summon. So when you want to summon this from your hand, you simply drop it down to the field, and your opponent doesn't have time to react until it's already summoned. This can be compared to a card like Galaxy Soldier. So if you look at this card's effect, it says, you can send 1 other light monster from your hand to the graveyard, semicolon, special summon this card from your hand in defense position. So because it is a semicolon, this card's effect to summon itself does activate. That means when you activate this in your hand, your opponent can respond by activating a Spell Speed 2 card and have their effect resolve before this monster's effect to summon itself. The last thing about problem-solving card text that I want to point out is conjunctions. So conjunctions on card effects mean very specific things. So, for example, the effect of Swift Scarecrow is negate the attack, then end the battle phase. This means that the 2 parts of the effect happen in order. So negate the attack happens first, and then end the battle phase happens second. Also, it means that for the effect to end the battle phase to happen, you have to first negate the attack. That means if Swift Scarecrow somehow fails to negate the attack, then the battle phase does not end. And then the effect of Wind Up Rat uses the conjunction and. So it says, change this face-up attack position card to defense position and special summon that target in face-up defense position. That means both switching this card to defense position and special summoning the target happen at the same time. And if it also means that if either of them cannot happen, the other one also does not happen. So both effects have to happen at the same time, and neither of them can be prevented from happening for the effect to work properly. If something is preventing one of them, then both of them will be stopped. The next one is and if you do. So, for Level Eater, you have to target a monster, reduce its level by 1, and if you do, special summon this card from the graveyard. So for this card, both effects happen at the same time once again. However, in this case, if something is preventing the second effect, the first effect still goes through. Conversely, if something stops the first effect, reducing the level, then you are not able to special summon this card from the graveyard, because you have to complete the first part of the effect to do the second part of the effect, even though they both occur at the same time. The next type of conjunction is also. So for this card, the effect is you can banish that monster, also banish this card. So for this type of conjunction, both effects happen at the same time. However, these 2 effects are not connected to each other in that if one of the 2 effects is prevented from happening, the other one still happens. The last one is the least used. This one is
also after that. So this isn't the best example of this type of effect, but I actually couldn't find any better examples in all the cards I own. So this rarely comes up, but what it means is that once again, like the also conjunction, the two effects are not connected to each other, and that if one is prevented, the other one still happens. However, in this case, they happen sequentially. The first part of the effect happens before the second part of the effect. And in the conjunction where it just says also, they happen at the same time.
The last part of problem-solving card text that I want to point out is targeting. So
you target at the same time as you pay cost. It'll be written between the colon and also the semicolon. So there's the colon and there's the semicolon. So in this card it says you can target one wind-up monster in your graveyard.
So basically, targets are cards you have to choose when you activate the effect and before the effect resolves. Another thing that I like to point out is if you cannot pay the cost, you cannot activate cards.
So for example, Effect Veiler, the cost is you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard to target one face effect monster your opponent controls. So if there is a card currently preventing you from sending monsters from your hand to the graveyard, you cannot pay the cost of sending this from your hand to the graveyard, in which case you are not allowed to activate it. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the battle phase and the damage step. So this is probably the most complicated part about Yu-Gi-Oh! So I'm not going to go as full into detail of this phase as I can, but I would still like to talk about it at least somewhat. So the battle phase starts with the start step. Usually there's nothing that happens during this step, but both players are allowed to activate quick effects during this step. Following the start step is the battle step. The turn player, while in the battle step, can choose to either declare an attack, which causes the players to go to the damage step, or they can go from the battle step to the end step, which causes the battle phase to end. Every time you go to a damage step, you repeat by going back to the battle step after the damage step. The damage step is where you calculate the result of the battle. Say you attacked with a Hanzo into a defense position Galaxy Soldier. You would look at the attack and the defense to see which would win the battle. Just like I talked about in my video on monsters. A lot of stuff can happen during the damage step though. And the damage step itself is broken down into many different parts, which I'm not going to get into in this video because it would take too long. However, I am going to talk about the types of effects that can activate during the damage step, because you are limited in which cards you are allowed to activate during the damage step. The first type is counter traps. All counter traps can be activated during the damage step. The second type is cards that modify attack or defensive monsters that happen to be quick effects. So any quick play spells, traps, or quick effect monster effects that change attack and defense can be activated during the damage step. So for example, this card causes the monster you target to lose 800 attack until the end of the turn. The next type of card that you can activate during the damage step is a card effect, usually a monster effect, that negates the activation and destroys the card that it's negating. So there's quite a few monsters that actually do this. Herald of Perfection, for example, says negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. So cards that say something similar to that are generally cards that can be activated during the damage step. And then the last main type of cards you can activate during the damage step are trigger effects that happen to trigger during the damage step. So Mystic Tomato is a trigger effect that triggers when this card is sent to graveyard as a result of battle. So that means that it has to trigger during the damage step. So any trigger effect that triggers during the damage step will activate and resolve. The next thing that I would like to talk about is how destroying cards
does not prevent their effects from resolving successfully. So this is a mistake that a lot of new players can make. So for example, Mystical Space Typhoon destroys one spell or trap card on the field. So for example, if one player activated Torrential Tribute to destroy all monsters in the field, and the other player chained Mystical Space Typhoon to destroy Torrential Tribute, what would happen would be Torrential Tribute would be destroyed by Mystical Space Typhoon. Then the effect of Torrential Tribute would still go off, and it would still destroy all monsters in the field. Because even though Torrential Tribute is no longer on the field because it was destroyed, its effect still happens. Being destroyed does not prevent the effect from happening. To prevent the effect from happening, you would have to actually negate the effect using a card like Wiretap. Wiretap negates the activation of the card. Negating the activation of the card pretty much makes it so the card never actually happened, so the effect doesn't work in this case. The exception to this is with continuous spell and trap cards. So if you activate a continuous spell or trap card and your opponent chains Mystical Space Typhoon to destroy it, in this case the Tenki would be destroyed, and then Tenki's effect would try to resolve, but it's no longer face up on the field, so it can't resolve. And this only happens for continuous spell and trap cards. So they need to remain face up on the field to successfully resolve. This actually applies to both field spells and equip spells as well as continuous spell and trap cards. All other spell and trap cards do not need to be face up to resolve successfully. And for monster cards, most of them do not need to remain face up on the field for their effects to resolve. However, some of them do specifically say that they need to be. The next topic that I want to talk about is called missing timing. So with some monster effects, they can miss the time to correctly activate. So all of these effects are written as when something happens, you can do something. So the words when and you can are very specific in this case for missing timing. So for example, Hanzo has an optional trigger effect that activates when it's special summoned. So if a player activated Upstart Goblin to draw a card, and then Call of the Haunted was chained to special summon Hanzo, what would happen would be the chain would resolve backwards, Call of the Haunted would go first, Hanzo would be special summoned, and then Upstart Goblin would draw a card. So the last thing to happen in this case was Upstart Goblin drawing a card. Hanzo's summon was the second to last thing to happen. So because of this, you cannot activate the effect because it's optional. There are two similar types of wordings that cannot miss timing. So for mandatory effects, you cannot miss timing.
The effect of Arcana Force 14 reads, when this card is summoned, toss a coin and apply this effect. So this is not optional because it does not say you can toss a coin. If the monster has an optional effect, it would say you can do something. So in this situation, if Upstart was activated and Call the Haunted was chained to revive Arcana Force, the effect to toss a coin would still activate, even though the last thing to happen was gaining life points from Upstart. I actually misspoke earlier. I said the last thing to happen was Upstart drawing a card. But Upstart first draws a card and then gives your opponent 1,000 life points. So in this case, the last thing to happen would be your opponent gains life points. But Arcana Force is mandatory, so it does not miss timing. And the other type that does not miss timing is effects that read, if this happens, you can do something. So this is still optional because it says you can. So you can choose not to use the effect, but since it says if, it doesn't matter when it happened. So for when effects like Hanzo, it has to be the last thing to happen. But even if in this situation the last thing to happen is gaining life points, it still was summoned at a certain point. So even though it wasn't the last thing to happen, it still
will trigger correctly, and it will not miss timing. However, in North America, there is one exception where trigger effects that normally do not miss timing can still fail to activate. This is only for North America. So if you're playing outside of North America, this is not how this works. So say your opponent activated Mystical Space Typhoon targeting your Call of the Haunted, and you chained Call of the Haunted targeting your Teller Knight Untitled. So what would happen is the chain would resolve in reverse. Call the Haunted would resolve first, and you would special summon your monster. Then Mystical Space Typhoon would resolve, destroying Call the Haunted, and then Call the Haunted's effect would cause your Untitled to be destroyed. So even though your Untitled does not miss timing in this case, it is no longer on the field when its effect would normally attempt to activate. And since it's no longer in the location where the effect would attempt to activate, it is unable to do so. The next topic I want to talk about is something similar to missing the timing, but it's a different concept. I like to call it missing the opportunity to activate. So, if, say, in this situation, you had Upstart Goblin and a Call of the Haunted, and your opponent had a Torrential Tribute set. So, if you activated Upstart Goblin and then chained Call of the Haunted, and the chain resolved, Call of the Haunted would special summon Hanzo, and then Upstart Goblin would draw a card. So, in this case, the last thing that happened was Upstart Goblin, not the summon of the monster. So, Torrential Tribute, which can only be activated in response to the summon of a monster, cannot be activated, because the last thing that happened was Upstart Goblin and not the summon of Hanzo. The next thing I would like to talk about is Nomi and Semi-Nomi monsters. So this is something I've mentioned a little bit. Most extra deck monsters, Synchros, Exceeds, and Fusions, are Semi-Nomi monsters. This means that if they are properly summoned, either by Fusion, Synchro, or Exceed summon, then they can be special summoned from the graveyard using card effects after that. However, there are Nomi monsters. Some of the extra deck monsters will say must be Synchro summoned and cannot be special summoned by other ways. And some Fusion monsters will say Fusion summoned instead of Synchro, or Exceed summoned, depending on what type of card it is. And so, for these cards, even if they are properly Synchro summoned beforehand and they're sent to the graveyard, after that they cannot be special summoned by card effects. Some cards in your hand also work the same way. So, for example, this works like most extra deck monsters. It says it cannot be normal summoned or set. It must first be special summoned from your hand by banishing 2 monsters from your graveyard. So, the fact that it says must first be special summoned means that after you successfully special summon it, you can then special summon it again using card effects from your graveyard. The opposite is a Nomi monster like Dark Arm Dragon. So this one says cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by having 3 dark monsters in your graveyard, and cannot be special summoned by other ways. So this is a Nomi monster, and it cannot be special summoned after it's been sent to the graveyard. Only its condition will allow it to be summoned. And just for reference, some Semi-Nomi cards that are older, like this copy of Chaos Sorcerer, will not have problem solving card text, so they will say this card can only be special summoned by doing something. So if it says can only be special summoned, that's a Semi-Nomi monster, and it should be treated like BLS. If it says it cannot be special summoned by other ways, or it must be special summoned by its condition, then it's like Dark Arm Dragon, and you cannot special summon it even if you've successfully summoned it the proper way in the past. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the difference between use versus activate. So, for example, Call the Haunted says that you cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this card. So that means if the activation of Soul Charge is negated, say through the use of Solemn Warning, which can negate Soul Charge, then Soul Charge is treated as not having been activated that turn, and you are allowed to conduct your battle phase. This is different from the word use.
In this example, Wolf Bark says you can only use the effect of CotH Soldier Wolf Bark once per turn.
That means that if you activated the effect and negated its activation with Solemn Warning, it would be treated as not having activated this turn. However, it will be counted as being used this turn. So that means if you summon CotH Soldier Wolfbark once again, then the second time it's on the field you would not be able to use its effect because it was already used that turn. The next thing I want to go over are a few terms that aren't immediately obvious as to what they do. So the first of these is Excavate. So Curry Bandit says to excavate the top 5 cards of your deck and add 1 excavated spell or trap to your hand instead of the remaining cards to the graveyard. So what Excavate means is you take your deck, so say this is the top of your deck, you would take the top 5 cards, excavate them, so you would reveal them to both you and your opponent, and then you would do something with them, depending on what the card says to do. So in this case, we'd choose 1 spell or trap, put it in our hand, and send the other 4 to the graveyard. Cards that are excavated are treated as still being in your deck until they are moved to a different location. So that means that, in this example, Soul Charge is counted as being added from your deck to your hand, and these 4 cards are being treated as sent from your deck to the graveyard. The other one is Piercing. So
Gaia Dragon has the effect that if this card attacks a defense position monster, inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent.
What this means is that if a monster with piercing damage attacks a monster in defense mode, you do the difference in battle damage and inflict it to your opponent, which you normally do not do when you attack defense position monsters.
So in this case, you would compare the attack 2600 to the defense 1000, so there would be 1600 damage.
The last topic that I want to cover is alternate win conditions. So I've said previously that the main way of winning in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is to reduce your opponent's life points to 0. The other primary way of winning in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is if your opponent must draw a card and they are unable to do so because they have no cards left in their deck. This does not happen very often, but in drawn-out duels, it is possible that a player can lose because they do not have any cards in their deck. The other way is what is called alternate win conditions.
So cards like Exodia the Forbidden One can have effects that will allow you to win the duel. So, for example, Exodia says that if you have all 5 pieces in your hand, then you win the duel.
So there are a number of different cards that will allow you to win the duel when you achieve a certain condition, though usually these are purposefully hard to pull off, and so they are not as commonly seen as decks where you try to reduce your opponent's life points to 0, with Exodia probably being the most commonly played alternate win condition. So this was my video on some intermediate concepts, rulings that you'll need to be able to play Yu-Gi-Oh! My next video will be on some intermediate strategies, stuff that can help beginners get a better idea of how to play well when they start playing Yu-Gi-Oh!